So we all have days where we're not feeling it for whatever reason. You know, it might be that your body's all beat up because you've been training really hard, or any number of personal stresses that we all encounter in our lives. And all of these different things we encounter do affect our drive and motivation in subtle ways, and that's even if you've already got quite a high degree of mental fortitude. And this can happen for me in many different ways. You know, some days you'd have to literally physically restrain me from going to the gym because I'm that energized and passionate, and I go and I have an amazing session. You know, those sessions where you feel really powerful and like your mind and body are just completely in sync, and you slip into that flow state almost instantaneously and have a great time. But sometimes there's a strange thing that can happen, especially if you've been training for quite a long time, where you can feel that same pull, that buzz to go and train, but when you get there and you begin your session, you're just not really feeling it. And when this happens, you know, my techniques, they just feel off, and I'm not able to fire my body in the way I want to, and it just becomes really frustrating. And this is the kind of training sessions that I want to address in this video and give you some solutions to hopefully tackle it, because although there are certainly physical aspects to this, it's actually more like a mindset or a mentality issue, and is intrinsically linked with the expectations that we carry into training, even if we don't realise we have them. Now, when we do this, we put ourselves in a very precarious position because we're no longer in control, and our mental state hangs upon the outcome of that session. One side of that coin is that your expectations are met and you'll feel bliss, but the other is that they're not met and you suffer. And in its essence, this is actually a victim mentality where you're basically at the whim of outside circumstances. So I propose we take a new approach and neutralise that entirely. And so the first question to ask then is, what actually makes a good session in the first place? And I think the answer to this can sometimes not be so apparent. So when asking myself this question, the first thing that comes to my head would be when all of my movements are firing off correctly and I feel super sharp, on point, and very explosive and powerful. But as I hinted at earlier, these things are actually secondary in the chain of cause and effect and come as a result of entering a flow state. So what we need to understand here is that flow is absolute king and is really the tipping point between the session turning out good or bad. And this is actually really good news, because the ability to enter flow doesn't depend on how you feel or actually perform physically. And I know this through experience because I've had really good sessions where I feel amazing, and I've had really good sessions when I feel achy and tired at the same time. And the key to achieving this though is you have to be really aware of your mental state when going into a training session, especially in the early parts, which is easier when you are working on the same skills consistently because you've got something else to compare it to. For me, if I'm not feeling great in a session, I'll begin my warm-up and there's just something that doesn't feel right, and it expresses as me just not enjoying myself, which will often be accompanied by a kind of agitation and just feeling generally pissed off with life. And sometimes I can even pick up on this before I even get to the gym, while I'm sort of preparing my equipment. Now, we don't really need to investigate why this happens, and in reality it could be an infinite number of factors, because we've all had situations where the same thing can happen externally. For instance, somebody cuts you up in traffic, but depending on your mental state, your reaction to it can be entirely different. When you're feeling good and you're in a great mood and you feel fulfilled, it just is like water off a duck's back and you kind of get on with the rest of your day. In contrast to when you feel agitated, you know, everything about you wants to just get out of your car and smash their brains in. So evidently it's not the outer circumstances that make a difference, despite appearances. This initial realization is a golden opportunity, and you've caught it early, because the caveat to that is that the longer you remain in these low states, the more difficult it can become to actually rescue the session, you could say. And that's because mental states have their own kind of momentum that build the longer that they're remained in. But if you have managed to recognize that, then be easy on yourself and realize that you can still have a really good session. But you might have to just change the approach a little, and this is where those initial expectations have to be adjusted. And this is actually a really good example of something I mentioned in one of my previous videos, where I likened kind of being in that agitated mental place of resistance, like being in a car and pressing the accelerator while holding the brake simultaneously. And the solution you'll derive from motivational videos is just to push the accelerator even harder, thinking that that's going to make the car move, and just to suck it up and train anyway, which is not helpful and actually produces an inferior result to what I'm suggesting here. Now, it's likely that you will have some kind of plan of what you wish to do at that session, and it's not necessary to change that base structure depending on how you're feeling. But one really helpful option is you can change the components that exist within that framework, and there are many different ways that you can do this. One thing I like to do in this situation is, instead of going for a session where power and explosiveness is the focus, which entails you need to be firing on all cylinders, is instead to do a similar session, but instead make the focus total relaxation, technique, and fluidity. Power and explosiveness generally requires you to be in the optimal physical state, which you simply can't always be in, and then that makes it harder to slip into flow state if those are your parameters of success. Optimizing for fluidity and relaxation doesn't take much physically, but is just as important. So this is basically working with what you've got in the moment and making something great out of it, and accepting what is, even if it's not what you originally intended. And as a side note to this as well, there have been many times when I've done this in training and managed to get into flow. My mental state will shift considerably, combined with the fact that my body is now warmed up and feels very free, and I often find that I am able to start training much more intensely as a result of that. So this can end up being an alternative route, and you end up arriving in the same place that you originally intended anyway. And that was just one example, which is changing the focus of the session, and you can do this in other ways, like deciding to only work on a specific set of combos or techniques, but there are almost infinite ways to achieve this depending on your own activity and preferences. And this is something I used to struggle with quite a bit, but since adopting this approach, I've managed to turn around numerous sessions almost completely now. And when I first did this, I couldn't believe it was actually possible, because before it I used to just get into that negative state, and then I might still finish the session, but it would end up just being a very miserable affair. And it can be anything, you know, it can even be things like changing the music, which becomes the trigger to get into that flow. And this is something that had happened to me recently as well, where I'd gone into a session and my mindset had become quite fixed and rigid. I wanted everything to be technically sound, and I was just not enjoying myself. The session had become really boring, and I recognised it, and I was just like, I'm not enjoying myself here. So I knew I needed to take a different approach, and what I did was I switched up my music and started just playing around, moving to the rhythm of the music, like dancing almost, and it ended up being actually one of the most fun sessions I've had in a long time. And this method of training has now actually become something I like to do on the regular. Yes, that wasn't the original intention of what I wanted to do, but I flipped the script and made it a great session anyway. And really what's the most important thing here is consistency, and 10 training sessions of average or pretty good are always going to beat 1 session of absolute perfection and 9 terrible ones. And this basically acts like a pattern interrupt, because one of the biggest reasons this monotony in training occurs is because you're just doing the same thing all the time with no new stimulus. And that's something that's necessary in order to develop skills, but we need to find alternative ways in order to keep things fresh. Now, one concern you may have when hearing this is if that you're not pushing the limits all the time, that, you know, you're going to slow your rate of progression and your body's going to atrophy. And I used to be really neurotic about this, and I would always have this fear of losing skill by missing sessions or not being able to perform in the way I wanted during them. But something I've come to learn is that it actually takes a lot more for your skill to deteriorate than you probably imagine, and that's even if you've had an extended period of time off of training as well. And due to muscle memory and the associated neural pathways, your familiar skill level will return at a considerably rapid rate, and what's more likely to happen is you'll just be a little deconditioned and will probably ache for a while. So training can be a bit like reading a book. Sometimes when you feel really good, you'll easily get through a large portion of it. Sometimes it's just a chapter and you've had enough, and then if you're really bored and lacking focus, sometimes it's just a page. But regardless, you're still reading, and that's what matters. When you take the approach that I've illustrated in this video, regardless of how you feel physically, you're still putting yourself under constant exposure to the relevant techniques and movement patterns, and that's the most important factor that contributes to skill acquisition. You want to shift your focus and start to think long term about the continuous and consistent effects of training over time and what that will produce, rather than hanging on each session. So for me now, even after a lot of experience and knowing about this, it's still something that I have to contend with, and that high expectation mentality, we'll call it, is something that's quite ingrained within me. And I think that's happened due to having many great past experiences training, and so naturally you're going to prefer those feel-good emotions, and when they're not there, that contrast is quite apparent. I think as athletes and people who strive to achieve, this is something you have to be really careful of, because it seems to me to be quite a natural way of thinking for a type A person, and even more so when you have a deep love and passion for your chosen activity. And so of course you're going to want to do well and excel in it. So I feel this is a really important topic, because when I experienced this in the past and I had less awareness around it, I began to think there may be something wrong physically with me, or maybe I had some nutritional deficiencies or something like that, or even that I'd completely started to outgrow training altogether, which wasn't true at all. And if left unchecked, then you can begin to draw all sorts of false conclusions as to why you're not feeling it anymore, and get into this negative feedback loop of dreading even the thought of going training, which can obviously majorly deteriorate your mental state and is quite difficult to fix. So what I've been speaking about in this video is kind of like a way of approaching your training sessions that you can adopt to sort of make it more enjoyable and keep consistent. But this isn't limited to training by any means, and this is some kind of like a framework that you can apply to all different areas of your life, and something I've started to practice in many areas of my own life as well. Hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.